How important are pen pressure levels? Let's find out by comparing 4 different pens ranging from 1000 to 8000 pressure levels. That's up next. Thanks for joining me today. I'm digital artist Aaron Rutten, and it is my mission to help artists like you enjoy digital art and learn some new skills along the way. Today we'll be testing pen pressure on 4 different pens: the Wacom Intuos Pen and Touch with around 1000 pressure levels, the Wacom Pro Pen 1 with around 2000 pressure levels, the Wacom Intuos 2018 model with around 4000 pressure levels, and the Wacom Pro Pen 2 with around 8000 pressure levels. Now I know these are all Wacom pens, but this information will still be applicable to other types of tablets as well. So before we do any drawing, I want to mention something that's very important. The art application that you're using might have a maximum of how many pressure levels it can support. Now I wasn't able to find any information for how many levels are supported for each application, but if you do look under options in your Wacom tablet properties, it does imply that some applications might not support any more than 1000 pressure levels. That's just something to keep in mind. So now let's do a test with a really big brush, and we'll try to taper it off down to a fine point using pen pressure. Now when the brush is this big, you're really not going to see much of a difference in the pen pressure, so if you use a lot of big brushes, pen pressure might not really make much of a difference. I'll continue using a big brush, and I'll just extend that tapering a little bit longer, and then I'll do some tapered strokes, or I'll attempt to do tapered strokes with a thick brush. I'm finding it kind of hard to taper my strokes with the higher pressure levels, but with the lower pressure levels, it's a bit easier. Now I do want to mention that you can calibrate your pen pressure to make it easier to draw for the kind of pressure that you use, but in these demonstrations I'm just using the default pen pressure setting for all of the tablets. Now I'm going to use a medium-sized brush and do a really long taper where I let up on the pen pressure, and as I near the end of the stroke, I'm going to try to press as lightly as I possibly can. And what I notice is on the lower pen pressure, it's easier to get a very sharp taper. It's hard for me to get that really fine line width on the higher pen pressure resolutions, but the overall smoothness of the transition between wide to thin is much smoother on the higher pen pressure resolutions. Now you might notice that on the tablets that don't have a screen, the lines are a little bit more wobbly. That's because I'm holding the tablet up, and so it's kind of moving when I press down on it. I had to do that to keep it within the camera frame. So just ignore the wobbliness of the lines and just focus more on how evenly the pressure goes from thick to thin. Now I'll test pressure with opacity. I'm controlling the opacity, or how thick the paint is, or how transparent it is. What I'm doing is I'm starting with heavy pressure and I'm going to very light pressure to get that nice fade. Now again, what you'll notice is there's that smoother transition from dark to light over on the higher pressure levels. When you look at the lower pressure levels, it's a bit more jumpy. It jumps quickly from one level to another. I'm going to draw a similar stroke here. This time I'll start with light pressure, go to heavy pressure, and then back to light pressure again. And if you look very carefully, again, you can see with the higher pressure levels, that transition from dark to light back to dark is much smoother. Next, we'll use pressure to vary the opacity and blend one color into another. And just like the previous examples, the higher pressure resolution is a much smoother transition, whereas the lower resolution is much more jumpy. So if it's hard for you to see that, try blurring your eyes and looking at these examples, and you'll see that the transition from yellow to orange to red is more abrupt with the lower pressure levels, and it's much smoother and even with the higher pressure levels. Now I'm going to go ahead and use a very fine brush, and I'll try to taper my strokes and get a nice range from fine to very fine, something like you'd get if you were sketching or doing inking. It feels like in the lower pen pressure resolution that it's easier to get a very fine point on my line. It's more difficult with the higher pen pressure levels, but overall the quality of the lines is a lot smoother with the higher pen pressure levels. So now that I've done some examples with my default pen pressure setting, I'm going to go ahead and calibrate this a bit so it's softer and firmer, and we can see the difference that makes. I'll go ahead and make it quite a bit softer. And now it feels very difficult to be able to get a very thin line. I can get a pretty even middle-sized line, but it's hard to get that nice thin taper. I'm going to go back and I'm going to calibrate it the opposite direction toward firm. Now it's very easy to get that very thin line, but it's very difficult to get a very thick line. The pen that I'm using here is the Wacom Pro Pen 2. Now if I make my brush a bit bigger and I try that same thing where I go from light to heavy to light, then you can see I do get a nice transition. It's just depending on how you calibrate this, you're going to be able to get thick lines more easily or thin lines more easily. You have to try to find the balance to see what works best for you. Now I'm going to try to taper some lines using that firm setting. And I can get a pretty good taper, a nice even transition from thick to thin, but it's not quite as sharp as I want. Now if I go back the other direction, a little bit more towards the middle setting, then you can see it's very hard to get a taper. I get these very thick, bold lines. Now I'll try just one notch towards firm, and it's getting a bit closer to the kind of pressure that I like to use when I'm drawing. So for me, anything under 2000 levels of pen pressure, I'll set 1 notch towards firm. If it's higher than that, I'll set it 2 notches toward firm, and that works a lot better for me. One of the issues I have with the Mobile Studio Pro in regards to pen pressure is it feels like you have to press really hard in order to reach maximum pressure, so you might want to just set your own custom pressure curve to get the absolute best pen pressure setting. So after comparing these pens side by side, I've come to the conclusion that higher pressure levels can eliminate jagged or rough transitions between brush size and opacity. Higher pressure levels can also eliminate jumps between levels. Higher pressure levels give you more headroom for setting a custom pressure curve. Higher pressure levels are more noticeable depending on the kind of brushes you're using. It'll make the most difference in fine line art with a lot of brush size and opacity variation. It can also be nice for 3D sculpting where you might want to vary between light and heavy pressure, so you don't have to change your brush size or strength as often. Don't see much of a difference in any of these examples? Well, unless you're an experienced artist who has used a lot of tablets over the years, you probably won't notice a difference. And to be honest, I'm quite comfortable using any tablet regardless of how many pressure levels it has. I've made some great art with only 1000 pressure levels, and anything under 1000 pressure levels does feel a bit awkward, but above that, I feel just fine at around 1000 or 2000 pressure levels. As I move on up to 4000 or 8000 pen pressure levels, the line feels a bit smoother, but it feels a bit more difficult to get that thin to thick ratio without creating a custom pressure curve. So to me, pressure levels are important, but they're not as important as the size of the active drawing area on the tablet, the comfortability of the pen, the additional features of the tablet, or the overall product quality. So let pressure levels be a factor in your decision to buy a tablet, but don't give it too much influence. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video, and if you're enjoying all these free videos I'm creating for digital artists, join me on my mission to create more resources like this at patreon.com/AaronRutten. And click that subscribe button if you'd like to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.